Okay. Let me welcome all of you to this beautiful evening. And let us welcome Isabel Huacuja Alonso. I hope I got it right. To this talk, Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, Hindi film song, fan fiction on the radio airwaves, 1979. While choosing the topic, I persuaded Isabel to go beyond her book, Radio for the Millions, which many of you have read, I know. And many of you, or those who have not, should read it. She has published her essays in several journals, including Passcode, and a couple of editors are present in the audience. And there are lots of listeners also present in the audience. So we do both kinds of discussions, academic discussions and non-academic discussions around listening, radio, music history, the interface between cinema and radio. So this is the first time that we are having a conversation where an academic is presenting to all kinds of people, a mixed audience. So Isabel has also edited a special issue of a journal on war, right? On World War II. And rethinking the Second World War in South Asia. And I have enjoyed reading her, listening to her. And so she will, this is the compromise between us, that she will take off from the book and will present something new to us, which some of us have not read, right? So without further ado, Isa.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor to present here, particularly with among radio listeners and radio broadcasters, but also among scholars that I have known for so long. The issue is not so much about not presenting from the book, but about the difficulty for me about presenting on a little bit outside of my field, on cinema. But so what I'm about to present today is a draft of a journal article, and for the journal's Cinema and Media Studies, Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. So as I'm sure most in this audience are well aware, Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, or story full of songs, is a genre of lowbrow broadcast audio studies, sometimes authored by radio listeners and sometimes by broadcasters, that features 4 to 6 Hindi film songs. And the audio stories did not rehash an existing film plot, but instead they create a new narrative context for well-known songs from various films. So focusing on the genre's peak years, which I think are the 1960s and early 70s, and on Radio Ceylon's program Panghat Par by the World's Edge, but while also briefly considering the genre's evolution, I hope to demonstrate in this talk that this uniquely South Asian storytelling genre is a kind of audio or radio shared fan fiction. And then I hope to tell you why that matters. From the current, let's see. So as Ravikant kindly mentioned, I have recently published in 2023 a book on radio, and I came to this topic through the research on that particular book. In particular, through the work on the 4th chapter on Radio Ceylon, which I called Radio Ceylon King of the Airwaves, which studied the stations and transnational routes, but also studied the way that songs worked. And in that chapter, I account for technology's own porous borders. After all, Radio Ceylon's productions were an excellent example of what scholars have called convergence or transmedia. And yet, while I trace various, the exchange across various media, radio, film, and gramophone records, my focus in this chapter is unapologetically on audiences' oral experiences of films, and in placing what and placing the sonic experience in the larger context of the Indian subcontinent's cultural and political history. So specifically, that chapter argues that Radio Ceylon helped forge what I called an oral filmy culture across borders in post-independent South Asia. But it also argues for the importance of the ways in which songs and films circulated orally, and for reversing the kind of focus that we often have in cinema, where we give more prevalence to the visual. So this is an ad from the Times of India, advertising a film that I had never heard of, Shar Darvish, and I suspect a lot of us had not. And the selling point of the film, or the most important part of the film that sells the film, is that the songs are hummed in Radio Ceylon, that they're heard, and that "Gusse mein bhi tum aur achhi lagti ho." Yeah, mashallah. And ignoring the sexism part of it, right? What struck me about this is that it nicely showed how paying attention to the listening of cinema might be a way to reverse our normal understanding of it. And from working on this chapter, I did so very much in conversation and in aligning myself with the work of previous scholars that had argued that Hindi film songs and their reception should be studied as the leading element of Hindi cinema, not as an auxiliary or to visual experience or as interruptions to visual films, but rather as the leading aspect, and specifically the work of Vibhuti Dugal, who was part of SDS, and of course of Ravikant as well. So based on that, this paper emerged, so this idea to work on Geeton-Bhari-Kahani emerged from a dissatisfaction in the chapter, which I felt that while it explained the format of Radio Ceylon programs, it didn't do full justice to what I felt was a kind of literary aspect developing in radio at the time period. And I wanted to pay more attention to that, and specifically to the Geeton-Bhari-Kahani programs that aired on Radio Ceylon, but also on other radio stations, including the All India Radio Urdu program, as well as in Vivid Bharati. And most of these programs, often as many radio programs went out live, which means that we rarely have recordings of this particular genre of writing. In conversations and in interviews with broadcasters, one of the ones pictures here is Mujib Siddiqui from All India Radio Urdu service. I learned about his work for writing for Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, and he also kindly shared with me some of the scripts that he kept for them. Similarly, Harmandir Singh Hamras, which I'm sure many of you know quite well, right? Not only who is, of course, the author of the Geet film Geet Kosh, is it Filmi Geet Kosh? Film Geet Kosh. Not only, he also kept copies of many of his radio submissions, and particularly, he kept copies of his Geeton-Bhari-Kahani stories. And the fact that he kept copies of those stories is also significant for more than 50 years ago to the kind of value that he associated from that. So the chapter and the idea to work on Geeton-Bhari-Kahani separately, beyond All India Radio and beyond Radio Ceylon, but as a genre, emerged from those particular conversations. As I mentioned, I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone in presenting this chapter, as I don't see myself as a scholar of cinema or music itself, but rather as a scholar of radio broadcasting and a historian of radio broadcasting that had to come to cinema through the work on radio. It's impossible to write about the history of radio in South Asia without taking into account the role of film songs, right, on the radio. And sort of that's the way I came into it. This is my first time sort of writing and presenting something that is specifically focused only on that part of it. So just to give you a background of how Geeton-Bhari-Kahani emerged, Shiv Kumar Saroj was a broadcaster for Radio Ceylon, one of the first ones, excuse the misspelling there, one of the first ones to join Radio Ceylon and to go to Sri Lanka from India. And he was one of the author of and the creator of many of Radio Ceylon's earlier programs. he came up with the idea for a program called Panghat Par that featured stories, and that featured various stories from film, various stories that use film songs from various films to tell a new story. Himself a lyrist and an accomplished writer, he wrote all of those stories himself. And unfortunately, because these stories went out live, we don't have a copy of a single one of them, to my knowledge. Manohar Mahajan came to Radio Ceylon in 1967 and replaced in many ways the work of Shiv Kumar. And when he joined Panghat Par, when he joined Radio Ceylon, he was in charge of continuing the program Panghat Par. And he felt that he could not possibly have the time to write stories himself. So he began asking radio listeners to actually provide the stories for it and to read their submissions out loud on the radio. What's important here, though, is that the late 1960s also coincided with a time period when increasingly Radio Ceylon broadcasters were using more and more listener-based submissions, and were incorporating the role of listeners more, as opposed to an earlier time period when you had more of the programs like Binaka Gitmala, who had lesser of a participation, still participated, but lesser of an involved participation. Manohar Mahajan it's impossible to prove, but he is sort of can be credited with coming up with the term Geeton-Bhari-Kahani. He's famously organized, began his program with, this is Panghat Par or Hum Log Panghat Par Geeton-Bhari-Kahani Sunenge, right? And but immediately, even after his departure in 1974, the program was no longer played in Radio Ceylon. But by then, it had already become a genre of its own, with the All India Radio Urdu service beginning a program called Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, for which broadcasters like Mujib Siddiqui and Farooq Jafar wrote Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, wrote stories full of songs. And later, as some of you might be familiar, Amin Sayani also inaugurated a number of Geeton-Bhari-Kahani-like stories, among them Modi Sangeet Khasana and Modi Sangeet Kahani, and it has nothing to do with our contemporary Modi. It's Modi, a cotton brand of the time period. So, who is this Modi? I've never heard of him, right? No, this Modi, this is a cotton brand. It's a cotton brand that was announced. And this Modi Mills. Modi Mills. Modi Mills. No, but this was actually a more famous Modi at the time, right? In reading Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, I want to think of Geeton-Bhari-Kahani as a form of fan fiction. And scholars have long come up, among those, Francesca Scopa has come up with ideas as to what makes up fan fiction. And I think that Geeton-Bhari-Kahani make up fan fictions. The stories full of songs that aired on Panghat Par fulfilled 4 of the 5 characteristics that media scholars and self-identified fan herself, Francesca Scopa, marks as a defining fan fiction. They were, first, amateur works circulating outside the literary marketplace. They were deeply intertextual. Geeton-Bhari-Kahani featured songs from different films and often referenced or alluded to several films in a single story. The genre consciously transformed copyright material, creating new narrative contexts for copyrighted songs, right? And these stories full of songs were also, fourth, a gift, a kind of gift made within and for a particular community of fans. Now, of course, we can argue that Geeton-Bhari-Kahani buttressed a capitalist system in which Hindi film songs circulated. And authors saw themselves as belonging to and writing for a tight-knit community of devoted Hindi film song fans and radio listeners. So I think they still constitute a form of gift. And I wonder what the listeners here and broadcasters can tell me about that. They, however, do not fulfill a key 5th category. Fan fiction is speculative fiction about characters rather than the world. In these stories full of songs, it is not the bodies of film characters or the bodies or actors or disembodied voices of playback singers that take center stage. Instead, Authors generate fresh narrative context for well-known tunes. Scholarship on fan fiction has long emphasized how fans feel that they personally know characters and how this intimate knowledge of spurs fans' creativity. I frankly think that the fifth category is simply wrong as to what fan fiction is, and that knowledge and intimate knowledge of film songs can also create a form of fan fiction. So in this article, I make three arguments or three main points. And the first one is particularly that the fifth category, long accepted as essential to what fan fiction is incorrect. That fan fiction need not center characters or bodies, that it can center songs, and I'll explain how. The second one that I want to make is that in South Asia, the medium of radio, and in particularly the late 1960s and 70s, was characterized by what we might describe as an ultra-participatory culture that in many ways anticipated the internet's participatory culture and the boom of fan fiction. And I want to emphasize the importance of thinking about radio in this way, right? And the third, and one that I am very interested in hearing the audience's opinion, is that I want to think of broadcasters and listeners as having a shared identity as fans of film songs, and to move away from thinking of them as opposite sides. So let's begin by listening to some film songs. And let me try to walk you through one of these stories. So Hamras, the listener presented earlier, co-wrote the story Atit Ki Yaadein, or the past memories, with his friend Raj Gupta, a friend and fellow film lover, when he was completing a degree in science in Kanpur. And North City, obviously, you know where Kanpur is. Atit Ki Yaadein begins by introducing us to the main characters, Sashi and Shekhar, who both are college students in Kanpur. Sashi walks home from school when it suddenly begins to rain very hard. Completely drenched and unable to walk any further, she enters a stranger's house, whose door has been left partly open. There, Sashi encountered a young man engrossed in a book. She's immediately attracted to him, but she cannot gather the courage to greet him. When she slips and accidentally drops her books in a very filmy way, the young man stands up to help her and invites her into the house. And after that propitious monsoon-themed meeting, the two young students meet frequently. One night, however, Sashi senses that something is seriously wrong. She learns that Shekhar has received a letter from his mother explaining that she had become ill and asking him to return home. Shekhar leaves Kanpur and we hear. And dun. He has just left Kanpur. Sashi is alone now. I see everybody. There we go. I see everybody in the mood in the Birahini. So, like Sashi, the protagonist of the song feels lost without her lover. The separation was so painful that it felt like a kind of death. And in this way, Hamrasan Gupta introduced the trope of Birahini, the woman suffering in a state of vira or separation from her lover, which will become the story's leading theme. As Peter Knapsack explains, Birahini played a crucial role in literary cultures of North India for several centuries, and it experienced a revival in Hindi-Urdu cinema of the 1940s and 50s, particularly in song lyrics. Hamras and Gupta, both devout film music fans who had a special sensibility for poetry, picked up on this important development. And in Atit Ki Yade, they exclusively featured Birahini theme songs from the 1940s and 50s. And through their lyrics, they told the story of the Kanpur Bei Sashi's separation from her college sweetheart. So a few weeks later, Sashi receives a letter from Shekhar, noting that he has reached his village. Desperately alone in Kanpur, Sashi cannot help but wonder why Shekhar had not come into her life, only to depart and leave her completely heartbroken. And then we hear the story's second song, which I'm not going to be able to play that one. As Anna Wilson notes, fan fiction is a heuristic tool. It is a mental technology that facilitates understanding of a text by means of an affective hermeneutics as a set of ways of gaining knowledge through feeling. Put differently, affective hermeneutics is a way of gaining knowledge of a text through a kind of emotional immersion. Wilson's focuses on fans' intimate knowledge of characters. When writing a character backstory, a fan would draw on her intimate understanding of a character, gained through the knowledge of the character's actions, behaviors, and affective expressions. Writers of Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, however, develop intimacy with songs and not with characters, because in this genre of fan fiction, songs and not characters motor the stories. So by creating a new narrative context for the song Jo Dil Mein Khushi Aaye Ban Kar Aaye, oh, that's the next one. No, that's this one, Ban Kar Aaye, which had originally appeared in Bari Behen, Hamras and Gupta gain a more intimate understanding of the song, and in particular of his lyrics. If Shekhar had brought light to Sashi's life, his departure had turned her world dark. Yet the affective hermeneutics, I don't know how you pronounce that, hermeneutics of fan fiction is a collective experience. What is it? Hermeneutics is a collective experience. Hamras and Gupta are not the only ones who experience a kind of, but Hamras and Gupta are not the only ones who experience a kind of emotional immersion. As some of the listeners here could tell us, the listening audience too gains intimate knowledge of the song through Sashi's life story. It's also significant that Lata Mangeshkar, by then the leading playback singer of the Hindi film industry, interprets this third, first, and all the songs, except for the last one, in this story. This creates an interesting interplay between celebrity and ordinariness. Lata and her magnificent star power give voice to the very ordinary Sashi, who, like Hamras and Gupta, resides in Kanpur, an industrial city far from the cultural centers of the country. So in Atit Ki Yade, Lata's voice, the oral stardom it evokes, plays a crucial role. Well, with very little narrative collection, the story moves into a fourth song, which also focuses on the pain of separation experienced by a female character. Gusra hua zamana aata nahi dobara. Sashi tells us through the song and the voice of Lata again about her loneliness. Sashi stops reading and writing altogether. She starts working at an office, but she found no meaning in her work. She worked like a machine and her health deteriorated significantly. So this is the last of the Virahini theme songs, but one that, unlike the previous ones, offers a glimpse of hope for unification and plays a crucial role in changing the story's mood. So now we think, Vapas aane wale hai. And then he plays a trick with the audience. In the story's final scene, Sashi returns home from her office feeling sick. She has a high fever and falls asleep immediately after reaching her bedroom. Is this me? No. No. In the morning, she wakes up to the sound of birds chirping and is surprised, as we are, to find her beloved by her side. Sashi's body, overwhelmed with joy, fails her. She's too weak to stand up and greet her lover, and he carries her and she breathes her last breath in her arms. And we hear. Sorry. This one I have to play. So you're going to hear an ad. Songs featured in the song filled stories and the original films where the song appears even more explicitly. So in another story, which in the interest of time, we can't, also written by Hamras and Gupta, there's a scene of a couple and the couple sing together and immediately, and they use the song from Dul Ke Pul. And it's, any listener that had seen the film would immediately recognize that the scene is put back again, right? And this is one of the ways in which he plays with fandom. There's extra enjoyment if you have actually seen the film. It's not said explicitly, but there's an extra enjoyment for it. Now, Hamras, as I noted earlier, was an extremely knowledgeable film song connoisseur, and as was likely his co-author Raj Gupta. Now, this submission stands out from others in that it relies almost entirely on songs, and more specifically on lyrics, to tell the story. It makes more demands on listeners, requiring that they listen intently to the various songs. Lyrics and decipher the figurative meaning to follow the storyline. Just as in films, songs in Geeton-Bhari-Kahani could serve a diverse set of purposes. So in other ones, for example, they can often be done to distract, to make a mood, or to simply have an emotional break from it. Oh, am I on time? 15 minutes, right? So I don't have a lot of time to go through this entire story, but this is a story called Tishnagi, Thirst, and it was aired on the All India Radio Urdu service. It's also it was likely performed by several actors rather than only read by a broadcaster, just given the way the script is written. And it was authored by Farooq Jafar, which some of you might know as she became an actress later in life. She was in a number of them, but I'm trying to remember her last. Anyways, so Farooq, and in this story, the various songs used in the story are actually not songs that move the narrative forward in the ways in which they move the narrative forward in Atiti Ki Yaad, but they're actually stories that help bring simply a certain kind of mood to it. So the story follows an alcoholic poet who is unable to leave alcohol and for that reason is unable to find love in his life. And the various songs that are selected are meant to create that particular mood for it. So whereas the songs in Atiti Ki Yaad steer the narrative as they take us through the various stages of Sashi's emotions, in Tishnagi, the songs play a more sideline role. They complement the narrative by helping create the mood or by providing a needed respite. And then perhaps most notably though, in all or almost all the Geeton-Bhari-Kahanis that I accomplished, that I was able to read or come in contact with, love plays a leading role in both stories. Not surprisingly, Geeton-Bhari-Kahani echoed Hindu cinema's focus on heterosexual romantic love. Yet, while the love described in Hamras' stories is certainly heterosexual, it's not entirely normative. Hamras, in all his stories, speaks of a kind of love that can exist outside of marriage. In Smitri Ki Rakhe, another one of his stories, the protagonist insists that we must honor and celebrate the love that he and Rekha now share, even though it can only exist outside of marriage and it can never be continued. So studies of fan fiction have long emphasized the importance of queerness in fan fiction. Often queerness in the studies is not limited to same-sex relationships, but understood more broadly as a desire for coupling outside of normative boundaries. Now, the limited archive to us, and again, one of the things about dealing with radio is that we always have a very limited archive. Ravikant can certainly speak to that. Keeps us from making any firm conclusion. But Hamras' stories do suggest that non-normative love remain a leading theme in these stories full of songs. There was, however, one type of love, in my opinion, that is a constant and that we can have no doubt in Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, and that solicits further attention, and that is fanish love. That is the love of being a fan. As Kristen Barton notes, being a fan means being in love. Love is not necessarily to the right. Love is not only necessarily to the writing and creating of fan fiction, but is to its reception. So after all, fan fiction assumes an audience that not only knows a text or a source, but loves it. And it's this loving intimacy that is at the heart of fan fiction's desire to provide more and more from. But to understand and contextualize this Spanish love, we must consider the larger participatory radio culture of the early 1960s and 70s. And I'll do this briefly. Fan fiction of Geeton-Bhari-Kahani did not emerge out of anywhere. It comes out of a larger participatory culture that made listener-authored content be part of radio. That was so important in the 1960s. And you can see this in the available archives as well. Hamras's submissions that included Geeton-Bhari-Kahani also included submissions to other radio programs, including the program Vakya Chitanjali, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where listeners would write a sentence poem in which each of the first word was the first word of a song that they would play. One that Hamras claims was very important to the development of his Geet Kosh. The program Drish or Geet, which I'm sure many of you are familiar, is when a listener would describe a scene from a film in his own words, and then it will be followed by the playing of the song. And the broadcaster would read the description by the listener. Hamras participated in many of those. And I think the one that is closer to Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, which is I also felt that served as a kind of practice for it, is Jab Aap Ga Uthe. So when you broke into song, right? And you would describe a moment in which you're thinking about something and all of a sudden you broke into song. So the submission we have here is Hamras is struggling with his life, and all of a sudden he thinks of one of Talat's famous songs, right? Tasveer banata hu, tasveer, I can nahi banti, tasveer banata hu, tasveer nahi banti, right? And it's important to understand that Geeton-Bhari-Kahani's fan fiction is kind of the epitome within this ultra participatory radio culture of the 1960s and 70s. And then, towards the third argument, or the third point that I want to make, which is the relationship between radio listeners and thinking of radio listeners and radio broadcasters as being part of the same community. In my book, I had described the ways in which radio programs allowed listeners to take on broadcaster roles through the reading of radio letters. Letter exchange programs where broadcasters read listener-authored letters represented an opportunity for listeners to finally earn a voice, to become, if only for a moment, a broadcaster. Clearly, the original program, Panghat Par, is an example of a radio program that effectively blurred the line between broadcasters and listeners. Right? Because listeners would write letters to it. We can read the end of Panghat Par in 1974 when Manhajan left Radio Ceylon as the end of this kind of radio broadcast fan fiction, and it transitioned to a more professional mode. Since broadcaster authors earned a living solely through their radio programs, these stories were far more complicated or far more implicated in a capitalist system than in the gift economy associated with fan fiction. So the story of Farooq Jafar, for example, is written for an income, right? Or the story of Mujib Siddiqui is written from an income. However, I think that if we dismiss these broadcasters' author stories, we might miss an opportunity to account for the centrality of fan labor to South Asian oral cinematic cultures and to popular culture more generally. Most importantly, we miss an opportunity to understand how radio broadcasters bonded with listeners and created a sense of intimacy so many contemporaries associate with the medium. And so many broadcasters often describe themselves as Hindi film song fans, right? So here I wish to argue that the stories penned by broadcasters and aired on the radio, including Sayani's more polished productions and Farooq Jafar's productions for Tishnagi for the All India Radio Urdu service, are still very much the product of fandom. Right, and I want to think about as that being part of a single community. So now, to recap the three main points that I want to make. First, I think that looking at the role of Geeton-Bhari-Kahani shows that fan fiction, if we step outside the global north, need not be character focused to be fan fiction. Geeton-Bhari-Kahani do not center bodies or characters, singers, or actors. Instead, they center songs as they create fresh narrative context for well-known tunes. Second, by centering stories' oral circulation on the radio waves, the article argues that at least in the Indian context, the medium of radio created a powerful platform for sharing and creating fan fiction, which preceded and anticipated the internet. I want to say that the radio was a place of sharing fan fiction as well. And third, the essay demonstrates that broadcasters and listeners enjoyed a shared identity as fans of film songs. And more broadly, it hopes to invite scholars of media cultures to seriously consider the historical significance of fan fiction author radio content produced in South Asia, and in the process to become a Hamras who is privy to the loves and confidence of indie film songs to radio programs. Right? And the end for it.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm sure lots of people here have lived the lives you are describing, and they have a lot to say. They continue to live the life, actually. And the medium has changed. They continue to live the life on the internet. The same kind of Geeton-Bhari-Kahani would continue in a salon, in Delhi, in a Delhi tea house, for example, or on the internet. There's so much material that still now the same fan culture that you're describing is all out there for all of us to see. So it's a living culture. Of course, the moment of the internet tells us how to look at the older cultures in the same mirror, the contemporary mirror. And it gives us fresh insights into a culture that existed, and we have traces and memories of those cultures now in various forms. And so wonderful. One thing to think about is that there's so little change in terms of programming from the days of 60s. If we look at Vivid Bharati, for example, especially the Sarkari radio, and also across Radio Ceylon and Vivid Bharati, not much has changed. And whether we are talking about Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, which is the first, which mirrors cinema itself, right? This is a Geeton-Bhari-Kahani. And then the story itself gets recontextualized all along. And the songs, of course, get recontextualized. The body, this is, of course, much more complicated, as Shikha and others have argued. The relationship between the body and the voice and the screen and the off-screen, etc., etc. In the sense that there's also an attempt, this image of Amraz with Manohar Mahajan, right? To come together in a physical form, right? And to remember it virtually, right? They continue to do that. Mahajan continues to play radio on Facebook almost till the day he died. So you have these fan cultures, for example, organizing in the same Kanpur stage shows where Talat Mahmood would be called, and he will be asked to sing all those songs that they usually sing in their private parties and things like. So it's a very complex loop, and it's a very evocative presentation that you are making. There are also abstract, programs like Chaya Geet.
Yes.
Where, as you rightly pointed out, the story does not really move. and there is a connection, there is a mood gets created, very rightly pointed out. So Chaya is still getting, aired. It is seen as the broadcaster's program. So broadcasters can, vent their feelings in that one program where listeners don't have a say. So yes, there's a lot to talk about. Isabel, मजे में उर्दू हिंदी हिंदुस्तानी बोलती हैं और समझती हैं, इसलिए आपके सवालात किसी भी जबान में हो सकते हैं और टिप्पणियां. I quite enjoyed it, your presentation, but I'm sure there's a lot to discuss here. Who goes first? Check. You want to? And of course, we'll take questions online. Of course.
सबसे intimidating questions होते जो online वाले हैं.
Yeah. Hello. Ji, I would like to ask only one thing. You have been talking about Geeton-Bhari-Kahani. See, basically, the songs which are included in this, they create some, hype, like love, affection, emotions. So they are more important. Geeton-Bhari-Kahani. And your first dialogue was, गुस्से में और भी खूबसूरत दिखती हो. और हंसी लगती है. इसमें एक गाना भी बना है, गुस्से में जो निखरा है इस हुस्न का क्या कहना. तो this is what I want to connect, and that's all. Thank you.
Okay. कौन है सुधीर जी? Kersi ji and Maya ji. Okay. From New Jersey, please go ahead.
Thank you for this opportunity. Wonderful show, Isabel ji, and your command over the radio station, which we have enjoyed over the years from the time that we were children. We listened to Radio Ceylon from the time that I was 6 years old and it first came on the air, and I listened to it for a very long time. However, there was just one small error, and it is not really an error. It was probably misinformation. When you played that song sung by Mohammed Rafi, "Is Dil Se Teri Yaad Bhulai Nahi Jati," that was ascribed to a film called Naaj Ghar. But actually, it's a non-film song, and which was really a parallel culture for popular music. And this was one of the great private songs. We used to call them private songs when we were growing up. And this was one of the great private songs that Muhammad Rafi sang. And at various times, the creation of that tune was given to different people. I grew up listening to the fact that it was composed by a musical team called Hussain Lal Bhagat Ram. But in later years, I was told that it was done by Hansraj Behel. All of them, just wonderful composers. But not having had the disc in my hand, I cannot say for sure who did it. But one thing I'm definite about is it is not from a film. But that doesn't take away from the glory of your program. It is beautiful. Thank you.
I think it adds to it because it shows, right, the value of fandom to it. No, I do have it. You're correct. And I think it's a mistake from the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, great.
Wow.
Yes, he has composed this song, and it is a non-film song.
So you think I have it on the actual paper as a non-film? Let me take a second to check that.
Thank you.
Shashi and Shekhar remind us of some literary references, don't they? Agye is a very famous novel.
Yeah, it's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is this desire? Do you also, I have definitely, felt it. reading this, what you are calling fan fiction, that there is this desire to, be recognized as literature of some sort in all the people who are writing into radio at whatever level, even if it is at the level of the city or at the level of the club or for which they are writing, and the magazines about which Vibhuti is writing. So this pressure of literature on radio, I always felt it while listening to radio, that the print it is that dominates the scene. And listeners are trying, in bringing out these magazines, are trying to find a kind of permanent space for a media that is ephemeral, right? For the sound that is going to evaporate in thin air.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to go back to it. On the actual paper, I have it listed as a non-film song. Here, I listed as filming from that because I got it from the YouTube video, showing the ways in which the internet can really get for the presentation. No, I mean, I think this is why I wanted to go with the fan fiction thing. And I didn't have time in the presentation to talk about that. But as a historian who trained in a history department rather than cinema studies, one of the difficulties with working with radio is not only its ephemerality, but the lack of respect it often gets as a maker of history, of part of it, right? And that lack of respect is on many levels. It's on the level of those who are writers and broadcasters who wrote for it, of listeners who did that, but also on the levels of scholars, right? And I felt that the idea, what fan fiction does is that it recovers that respectability for it. It argues for that. I think the program Geeton-Bhari-Kahani is the one that most actively does that. All of them did, right? And the culture of the 1960s that is still very much with us, the super ultra participatory culture when these programs were developed that really stayed till this moment, was, I think, the time when, to quote Vibhuti Dugal, when listeners were most actively looking for recognition, but also broadcasters were looking for recognition. And it's most strongly felt, I think, in this program, whereas the literal writing was stories, right? And the desire for it to be heard in the radio and to be heard and to be recognized for it. Also, in my interview with Mujib Siddiqui, who is also an Urdu writer and also wrote poetry, he always said that this was his favorite radio program to write for because he could get the chance to finally write and to finally write stories rather than only radio programs for it, right? So people very actively thought of it like that. It's also very telling to me, and I think I have listeners here that can say that many of the people that I interviewed remember the stories they wrote 50 years ago. They remember some of the songs they selected 50 years ago. So while I don't have that many manuscripts of it, I do have a lot of people with memories of the stories that they wrote 50 years ago. Does anyone here remember? They remember stories that they wrote. So to me, that shows the importance and of it being fan fiction.
That you want to come?
Shikha Jingam. Oh, it's a pleasure. Wow. Another person whose work I very much draw on this article and everything else. A pleasure to meet you, Shikha. And I'm actually very, embarrassed to present in front of so many.
So I was just thinking about, what you were saying, that it is not the character picking up that idea, that it is the songs that are important, right? And like many people have written about the fact, like Ravikant also, that how, and your work also, that how these broadcasters are finding new ways to curate,
right.
Like these are like curatorial, innovative kind of curatorial practices where you want people to listen to certain kind of songs. And of course, you also have a fan community, which is, coming along with you in that regard. So, I mean, I was just thinking that why there is these programs, the Geeton-Bhari-Kahani that you're talking about, doesn't have a deeper kind of diegesis, you know. Is it because you want to get into this kind of curatorial kind of, you want people to listen to your favorite songs, and also that you don't want to then get into a very complicated kind of a terrain as far as the story is concerned. So I was just thinking about that it's not going into the melodrama, it's not going, which films were, the films of the 50s and the 60s could be very melodramatic with all kinds of characters. But here you don't have that. You have a very skeletal kind of a story. So that was one. And if, it's not really, I was very curious to know what your thoughts were on that. And the second thing I was thinking about was about, how when we think about the Binaka Geetmala, and other programs also, but Binaka Geetmala, because it was listeners' choice, how you get actually a lot of genres, which are like, you get a lot of comedy songs, you get a lot of these patriotic children's songs like Jagriti, and all those different kinds of bhajans, or you will get the beggar songs, or you will get the Panghat song, so where the songs have been voiced by different kinds of characters, like Asha Bhosle. A lot of Asha Bhosle's songs, which she sang for children, were actually hits on the Binaka Geetmala, the comedy songs, so Kishore Kumar. So what I'm trying to say is that when the listeners are writing in for Binaka Geetmala, there is a kind of a broader kind of palette as far as the mood or the genre is concerned. Whereas in this kind of fan fiction, it is more to do with longing and desire and loss of love and all that. So these are the two things I was thinking about. And the third, was about that did it have?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
And I'm just thinking that this idea of this partition narrative, like this. But suddenly he's gone, like Shekhar has left, and she's like,
It's part of it.
That trope which keeps coming again and again, this idea of a sudden sign of pepper. So they songs that appear. So these were the three things that
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Just if I can add one thing to what you were saying about the listenership. Sri Lanka Broadcasting actually updated their stations powers. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The listenership extended from East Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. It was not just limited to South Asia. So you have Middle East, you have got all the Arabian countries, you have got East African countries, and you have all the Southeast Asian countries who are listening to these programs.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, I think I want to start with saying that we're limited by our archive. I have no doubt that there were stories of all types. The archive that I have that I've worked on is by particular listeners and particular broadcasters. And I think with Ittifaq, the two of them are so much focused on tragedy. I don't think that is true for all of them. And for example, for the Amin Sayani and Rama Sayani archive, the Modi one, there were plenty of stories that are not focused on that. So I don't think wouldn't want to make an argument that this is a kind of focus of those stories. I mean, I think that there were plenty of stories that incorporated other genres. And even the ones I have, they often, at least the Tishnagi story has at least 2 songs that are supposed to be upbeat. I don't doubt that there were other ones that incorporated other genres without it. I think that in this case, I'm sort of limited by the kind of archive that I have there. Your question about listenership and across borders. I mean, the Geeton-Bhari-Kahani genre became popular not only, I mean, all of this is listened in Radio Ceylon, which is in India and Pakistan as well. But the Radio Pakistan also had its own Geeton-Bhari-Kahani program, which incorporated songs from Pakistani films. I have not found a single transcript, so I have not been able to write about it, but I know for certain that that program existed, right? So by the 1960s, it becomes a huge, huge genre. To your last question about partition, I hadn't thought about it like that for this particular story, but I think that actually makes sense. He is writing at the time. This one's written in 1968, and he is writing at a time when a lot of radio is very consciously transborder. It is very consciously catering to listeners in India and Pakistan, and is very consciously talking about separation. So that story can certainly have that. It didn't occur to me to read it like that, right? It didn't. I think it's a great idea. Thank you.
So,
Thanks, Isabel, for the wonderful program and the presentation. We are talking about fan fiction in the time of the radios, and that was quite focused in terms of where it is broadcasted from and who is listening. As we progress over the decades and we come onto the internet, the fan fiction probably is still existing.
Bilkul.
And I believe the impact that the radio broadcasts had, the current fan fiction doesn't have that impact because it is so dispersed. It is so dispersed. It is so defocused, so to say, and it does not have a very fixed listenership or readership following, so to say. Everybody is writing and everybody is reading, and so what is happening to fan fiction beyond as you can say, the fall of the radio empires in some way? Although FM stations are still working, but there's nothing like what used to be in the 60s or up to the 70s. Internet has taken over, and fan fiction still exists, but totally dispersed. Nothing really impressive.
There was Geeton-Bhari-Kahani in Nilesh Misra, for example, of a different kind.
Box. Forget. Idiot Yade box.
Yadon ka idiot box.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I tried to get into the article, but I really resisted the temptation to make this about the internet, because I think that it is very easy that there's so much written about how the internet became a moment of sharing, how the internet has sort of allowed people to really put things out there. And I think that obscures a lot of what radio did. But I think you caught on a very particular difference between this fan fiction and the kind of fan fiction that we see on the internet, which is that while it was definitely for a community of fans, that community of fans was huge, humongous, and it was nowhere near as niche. And I think that the internet creates smaller, tight-knit ones, but nowhere near as sparse ones as the 1960s and the 1970s did, right? So the irony, and I think this is why the recognition is so important, and the fact that we don't write about it, that we don't think it as fiction, is so problematic, because it was such an important part of people's daily lives. It was such an important part of how people experience the world, right? This is how I think authors like Hamras and Farooq Jaffer experienced their youth, through this writing. This is how they express their problems, right? So for us to not take it seriously is to not take their lives seriously. So I wanted to move away from ideas of the internet. I mean, I think thinking about nostalgia and the internet is important, but I didn't want to make it a comparison, because I wanted to give it credit on its own worth, right?
Just one more point about the kind of content that was there in the Geeton-Bhari-Kahani of the 60s and 70s. They were not limited to the kind of things, because I remember hearing Geeton-Bhari-Kahani on the radio of so many different genres, so many different types of stories, children's stories, youth stories, office stories. I mean, there were so many different things that we heard on Geeton-Bhari-Kahani. They were not limited to just the tragedy of the romance.
So, for example, Sudhirji, this is a very important issue. Did we also hear, for example, about real villains in terms of caste, in terms of community? If it is a love story, there has to be some kind of villain. Did we hear of those also in these Geeton-Bhari-Kahani?
Yes, we did, actually. Yes, we did. There were social issues that were being brought into these stories. There were familial issues related to family relations and all that. And we heard those stories in that context, that these things are not right and this thing is to be done. And this was, I mean, they always connected songs into it. That's right. But there was a variety of
Of all
themes,
types, yeah.
variety of themes.
I mean, there's a few of them from the 1971 that I was able to collect. And there's a whole story about nationalism in the 1971 war, right? And the devil there is Pakistan in that particular story, and the evil person. There's another story about gender and education, and the devil there is the lack of that. So there are a number of those stories as well. It's just I had more of these than I had of those, but I acknowledge the limits of this archive, right? I think that's really, really important. I do.
The archive probably doesn't exist, but memories do.
Memories do, and
I
that's
remember-
where
I remember a
yeah.
lot.
that's where I got them.
Ravi.
Thanks. That was really engaging presentation. And it just struck me from this last set of interventions that what you need is an oral history of it. Because actually, there a lot
Yeah.
of this is to do with memory. And
Yeah.
it may be to do with the actual kind of capacity in some fashion for people who have lived, experienced, and listened to those things to be able to produce accounts. You know, it may be approximate, it may be kind of impressionistic, it may not be absolutely accurate, but nevertheless, that you yourselves are the resources which would become the way in which a kind of engagement with that past can be. Because from what Isabel is saying, one is difficult, the recordings are not available.
For
Huh?
for the AIR Urdu service, we have a few,
So that,
but they're later. They're
Yeah.
from the 80s, and they become a lot more. They're less raw. They sound like they're more a lot. That's why they're a lot more. मतलब इसमें sound effects आते हैं और ये है बिल्कुल समझ में आता है. It's not from that time period.
so the second thing which I was thinking about is that you do stress, and it may be the framing may change as the archive expands. So that you get many more things, as Chika
Of
says,
course.
the palette of stories, the various types of genres. But on the other hand, there are specific determinants. Two things come up. One is what Ravikant refers to as the literary desire. Huh?
Yeah.
This is one thing, literary desire, the desire to write, as being transmitted into through a combination with film music, isn't it?
That's right.
That's one thing. Which struck me when I was reviewing the material which you're showing is this intermediate dimension, because there
Mhm.
is this dimension of handwritten stories,
Ji.
and then there is what Shika says, the curation of film songs, which are recontextualized to
That's
create
right.
a certain type of mood, affect, whatever feeling. So here, one thing is this one specific question in terms of the actual presentation of this material, this making of a world through the combining of songs. How is this presented in relationship to actual narration? I was not quite clear, but the storytelling is one thing. It's actually the index of it is in the handwritten text, but how it actually works in terms of presentation. Is there a voice followed by lyrics, followed by... So this is one thing. How is it organized as a certain presentational form, as a narrational form, as storytelling? That would be one logic. The other thing which struck me is you specified, and here again, the archive may expand, but the question of character is not necessarily the object of the narration, of storytelling. It is a mood, an affect, a feeling, whatever it is. Or it may be comedic, from what I've just heard. But the key figure in this is the voice.
Yes.
So this question of the voice, one is, of course, the actual melodic form, the question of the voice, and the voice is determinate. It is a specific entity. It is the voice of Lata. It is the voice of Muhammad Rafi. It is the voice of Asha Bhosle, creating different types of moods and affects which they are habituated to produce. They produce these effects. Their voices actually kind of solicit a certain type of identification or an imagination which may not be specifically cinematic, but it's related to the actual creating a world through these voices and melodies, as much, and perhaps in the interspersal of writing itself as a kind of dimension. So I was just trying to rethink what is the composition of this form, what range of entities figures are actually drawn into the production of this story world.
Yeah.
And they become a series of vectors.
Thank you. That's a lot to think with. So I'll say one thing. I think oral history, for the first, to your first point, oral history is the only way to recover this, and it's really the only way to go through it. So most of these, the only way that I know, because I did not grow up with this music, of the format of these programs is by talking to listeners and broadcasters. And I think there has to be a larger recovery of the actual Geeton-Bhari-Kahani and the various songs, the various stories associated with it. As to the question of voice, I think that's one that can be expanded a lot. And it varied depending on the program. So as far as I know, for Panghat Par, the original one, it was read mostly by the broadcaster. And it was a performance similar to the letters performances. And we have a few examples of that. It's an emotive performance by the broadcaster reading the script, right? But it's still a reading. For the AIR Urdu service, there was light acting. I know that from my interviews. There was light acting. The story from Farooq Jaffer that I showed, the Tishnagi story, she was acting part of it, and then 2 other actors were acting it. And then for the Modi Sangeet program, which is put together by Amin Sayani and Rama Sayani, his wife was one of the producers, it's a full-blown drama. Full-blown drama. And that one is a little later, and it's like a modification of it. So I think to think about voice and the role of voice of it, we have to think across how it changes as well for various of them. But for this paper, I just needed to capture the genre first, if that makes sense. I needed to capture it first to put it together. And that felt very hard to do, which is part of the reason I think that why working with radio is so hard. It felt very...
So just to add to this part of the voice narration, and from my memory that I can recall, I remember Geeton-Bhari-Kahani with just the narration and the stories.
That's right.
There is a narrator, and there is a couple of other voices in there which are actually enacting some part of the story. Or there is another version in which the narrator is not there, and then there is a drama being played out.
Puri drama.
And this is before Amin Sayani. I'm talking about Vivid Bharati stories.
They had stories before Amin Sayani that they acted.
So,
even in the AR Urdu service, they had full acting in some of them too.
So I have a memory of these variations in this.
You're right. It just requires a lot more thinking.
Quick question. Did they ever use any effects? Like you said, birds chirping
They
and
did.
all. So they were using...
They did. As far as I know, they certainly did for the later ones, for the late 70 ones. I don't know. The problem with Panghat Par, for example, is that it went out live. So I don't know if they used effect for those. I don't. And I face the same problem with thinking about Awaaz De Kahan Hai, the program that read letters. It went out live, so we don't have recordings of that one. I can ask maybe some of the listeners. Do some of the early programs from 68 use effects when they did reading? I don't think so, right? Light. The Tishnagi one certainly did, because I talked to Farooq Jaffer before her passing, but it had light, what she called light acting. मतलब एक दो लोग होते हैं उसमें थोड़ी सी वो है और बस हो गया, पूरा drama नहीं था. And then Amin Sayani, that one was full drama, full blown drama for it. But they all emerged from the original one, which is just the broadcaster, as far as I know.
Pradeep ji.
देखिए प्रोग्राम तो इसमें कोई दो राय नहीं है कि काफी इंफॉर्मेटिव भी है, लेकिन ये मेरा फील्ड रहा है. मैंने 45 साल ब्रॉडकास्टिंग की है, आकाशवाणी में भी और कुछ प्राइवेट चैनल्स में भी, और मैंने लगभग 30 या 35 गीतों-भरी कहानी भी प्रस्तुत की है.
बात कीजिए.
इसमें 2-3 तरह की जो बातें हैं वह क्लियर करना चाहूंगा. एक तो यह है कि जब हम नरेट करते थे, अगर हम किसी नॉवल को ले रहे हैं या मान लीजिए हमने प्रेमचंद की कहानी ली, वो भी जाता था गीतों भरी कहानी में, तो हम उसे नरेशन फॉर्म में लेते थे अक्सर, जैसे मैंने दुर्गेश नंदिनी किया. लेकिन मुझे खुशी इस बात की है कि जो फैन मेल आई उसमें ये कहा गया कि शायद बंकिम चंद्र चटर्जी ने इन्हीं गीतों को सामने रख के ये कहानी लिखी होगी जो आपने बजाए. तो
और translated वाले भी करते थे. I
अच्छा,
that.
एक बात और, कई बार ऐसा भी होता है कि जब हम कहानी को सुना रहे हैं और वो लाइव होती है, बहुत से लोग उसे रिकॉर्ड करके भी करते हैं, और हम स्पूल के ऊपर सिर्फ हाफ सेकंड का पॉज देकर डिफरेंट इफेक्ट्स रिकॉर्ड करते थे और लाइव प्ले करते थे. तो उसमें क्या है कि विथ फुल ऑफ इमोशंस, और इसमें बहुत से लोग शायद सहमत ना हो, लेकिन फिर पत्र आते थे कि कहानी सुनने के बाद हमारे आंसू नहीं रुक रहे थे, या हमें ये अपनी कहानी लगी, हमें लगा कि ये तो हमारी ही बात हो रही है. जैसे मैंने मुंबई रेडियो पर एक बार एक कहानी सुनाई, वो मेरी एक फेवरेट स्टोरी है जो मैं शोज करता हूं उसके, एक मां गोमती की कहानी. तो जब मैंने उस कहानी को नरेट किया वहां, तो एक लेडी का फोन आया स्टूडियो में, क्योंकि उनके पास सबके पास नंबर्स हैं, जब गाना बज रहा था. वो फूट फूट कर रो रही थी और उन्होंने कहा कि मैं ब्लाइंड हूं, लेकिन ये मैं सब कुछ सुन रही हूं, महसूस कर रही हूं, और ये मेरी जिंदगी की कहानी लग रही है, बिल्कुल मेरे साथ ऐसा ही हुआ है. तो अनुभव भी ये है, लेकिन गीतों भरी कहानी कई ढंग से पेश की जाती रही है. जैसे हमें कुछ लिसनर्स वो भी अपनी कहानी भेजते थे कि आप इसको थोड़ा सा ठीक ठाक करके सुना दीजिए, या कभी ऐसा भी होता था कि आपने कुछ गाने सेलेक्ट किए, उनको ध्यान में रखते हुए एक सीक्वेंस तैयार किया और उसमें एक कहानी तैयार कर ली. जैसे आपकी टोटल 8 या 9 गाने बजते हैं 1 घंटे में, उनकी ड्यूरेशन हो रही है 35-37 मिनट, 40 मिनट, 20 सेकंड, वो 20 मिनट आपके पास है. आपने हर कट को उसके हिसाब से एक तरह से तैयार किया और पेश किया. तो गीतों भरी कहानी, जैसा अभी आपने हमराज साहब की या फारूक साहब की इनके बारे में बात की, मैं आपको ये बताना चाहूंगा कि आकाशवाणी के दिल्ली केंद्र से, विविध भारती तो है ही, यहां तक कि जो युववाणी सेवा थी उस पर भी गीतों भरी कहानी होती रही, और जो हमारा ESD एक्सटर्नल सर्विस डिवीजन, उसमें भी गीतों भरी कहानी सुनाई जाती थी, और अक्सर मेरे ख्याल से 90% केसेस में लाइव.
जी, thank you. I heard also one thing, मुझे सिद्दीकी ने कहा that हमारा एक ट्रिक था कि हम अंग्रेजी में ये कहानी सुनते थे, उसको तर्जुमा करते थे और अपना बनाया था.
क्या बात है. अंग्रेज शिखा, अच्छा ठीक है. करसी माया फिर से पूछना चाहते हैं आप कुछ?
Yeah.
Wanted to come in?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
It's amazing how a program like this opens up your subconscious. Lekin I have to go back a little bit to what was said earlier about the listenership of the Binaka Geetmala as it spread from Southeast Asia beyond that in the 60s. And I had the good fortune to talk with Amin Sahani Saab about 8 years ago. And I asked him why they had changed the signature tune of the program. And he said, Casey, the reason was the old signature tune was excellent. Sabke, it had been absorbed by the listeners and it was a hit song in its own way. But because the listenership was spreading, they had to give in something more contemporary, which is why they brought in the Spanish gypsy dance, which from 1960s onwards. The Opinaya tune, which was the original signature tune, was put aside, and the Spanish gypsy dance was included in as the signature tune. And also, Radio Ceylon at that time became a corporation, an international corporation. So it needed more recognition. So the signature tune was changed because of that. I know I'm a little bit out of context here because the discussion has moved ahead, but I just had to say this. Thank you.
Yeah, listeners often also remember signature tunes of all the programs. That's one thing I found very interesting.
That's the identity, yeah. era. Can somebody read it? It's very far from me.
I think I can read it. Thanks for this, Isabel, for this lovely talk. I was just curious whether the form of these fictional and fan fiction radio programs was influenced by the films or film narratives that they were watching. Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, I'm working with a limited archive, but I try to look at this fan fiction as being more important than the film itself, because I think that's how writers often saw it, right? It's displacing the main one and making songs the context of it, making songs the main one, just like the ad that I showed of Radio Ceylon, "Tum bhi aur achhi lagte ho gusse mein." But I think that it's really important to recognize that this work within a cinephilia concept, where being a fan of cinema is part of it as well, right? So absolutely, they always echoed it, and the songs echoed the fiction echoed that kind of world for it.
I want to just come back to this the Dhool Ka Phool song, and you said that you enjoy the song more if you have seen the film, listening to it. Ravi told me once about his mom. And the story, I mean, when she started, watching the films, the songs of which she had listened to on radio, when she started watching those films on TV, right, she had a different feeling. She didn't like those songs as much as she liked while listening to them. So it can go either way.
Absolutely. I mean, I heard that from listeners in Pakistan a lot. So I interviewed a lot of listeners in Pakistan who, for a number of reasons, often because those films were not available, did not see films. And they said, "Acha, jab film dekhi to bilkul maza nahi aaya tha." Aur achhi. So that I heard that quite often, right? And I think, so I definitely, there's no question, I'm not inventing. I'm drawing on much of the incredible scholarship on cinephilia and on South Asian cinema that is better than anything out there, I think. But I think that there's something to be said for for being a fan of song films that is separate from being a fan of films, and that it's a related but separate type of fandom. And I think it should be treated in its own right. And that's why kabhi ye achhe nahi lagte, kabhi achhe lagte hain.
Right.
The general opinion of the listeners is that songs are much better heard than seen.
Yeah, I mean, you hear that a lot from her. But you can't. Picturization.
That is Dulari's. क्या है वो? सुहानी रात ढल चुकी is picturized on Suresh, which is actually the waste of.
It's a waste of a song.
You listen to that song; it's a beautiful song, but when you see the picturization of that song, it is all rubbish. I never enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think
And
it's.
after that,
yeah.
I have not seen any picture. I normally don't see picture. I just listen to the song and I enjoy it more.
जैसे एक गाना है मेरे यार शब्बा खैर, वो दोपहर बाद का वो पिक्चराइजेशन है, वो कहीं शाम भी नहीं है, रात भी नहीं है। आज मौसम बड़ा बेईमान है, उसमें घटाओं की बात हो रही है और आप देखिए उसमें बिल्कुल नीला आसमान दिखाया गया है।
Okay, no more questions? हाँ जी।
बातें जो सॉरी,
Question.
ये सारी बातें जो हो रही हैं,
कैसी जी? हाँ ठीक है, अभी पहले मधुसूदन जी, देन कैसी जी।
हाँ एक मिनट, ये सारी बातें जो भी हुई हैं उसमें देखिए म्यूजिशियन जो म्यूजिक डायरेक्टर है और जो म्यूजिशियंस हैं वो मतलब जो डायरेक्टर है फिल्म का उससे कोई उसका कनेक्शन नहीं, मतलब ये जितने भी लोग कंसीव कर रहे हैं जो आइडिया, इनका कोई किसी से कोई रिलेशन नहीं होता है, दे आर ऑल इंडिपेंडेंट। तो इसीलिए ये फैलेसीज जो बताई गई हैं सिनेमा में एक्सप्रेशन की वो होती हैं।
That is not true, actually. Let us not.
Okay, can we debate this outside?
Because the song creation is a teamwork, and the lyricists, the music director, the musicians, the singers, they are all involved in it. Even the director is involved, but at the time of picturization, something else happens. So let us be very clear about that.
We do know that some people picturize songs better than others, right? Okay, so Kersi Saab,
A question that I want to ask radio broadcasters. I wanted to ask this one. In my experience, in most of Geeton-Bhari-Kahani, they did not credit the film ever. They did not say the name of the film in the story. Is that true, or have
that's
you found
interruption, right?
that would interrupt the story? So the film is not mentioned. So they wouldn't say like ye wahi hai Dhool ke Pool. Na? They would just play the song. Is that true for everything that you? Because I have found no. I want to confirm that as my. Did you credit the film ever? I have found no instances of the film ever being credited. Was there ever a Geeton-Bhari-Kahani जिसमें film को credit करते हैं? No, as far as I know, this was after the age of, this is the 70s. It was they just wanted the songs on the radio. So okay, never a program has ever credited the film. I've seen, yeah.
Okay, Kersi Saab.
हमारा काम छोड़ दिया इसने.
एक बार फिर शुक्रिया. As kids, we were so impassioned by the songs that we listened to. We totally fell in love with the music and the lyric and the singing, that many a time we used to skip school just to go and see a film. And more than half the time, we came out very disappointed in the picturization. Unless the song was a Raj Kapoor film or a Mehboob Khan film or a V. Shantaram film, or a B. Chopra film for that matter, we were always very disappointed. There is a lot of truth in the fact that the song that you see picturized on the screen is not the same as you hear on the soundtrack.
That's well said. Should we then wind up on that note? Thank you,
Thank you.
Isabel.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.